conceptual framework for statistics on international migration and mobility. You are probably aware that international migration is a topic up for discussion at the Statistical Commission in a couple of weeks. And the conceptual framework that we will introduce to you today is the core element that will be discussed and hopefully adopted by the Commission. So the main goal of our discussion today is for us to introduce the framework, provide as many details as we can, and for you to provide your feedback, ask questions. This is the time for you to tell us if you need any clarifications. So we are really aiming at the conversation with all of you. Before I introduce the distinguished speakers that we have with us today, let me just share with you a couple of pieces of info. First of all, the conceptual framework has been developed by the UN Expert Group on Migration Statistics. You may be familiar with the work of this group that was established by the UN Statistical Commission 2 years ago, actually almost 3. It was 2018 already. The group has been given a very broad mandate to improve international migration data. And among the many tasks that the group has been asked to cover, we have also been given the responsibility to update, to revise the 1998 UN recommendations on statistics of international migration. And this is really what brings us here today. So the first step, of course, in the revision of this ongoing, of the upcoming revision of the recommendations is to come up with a conceptual framework. This is what we will cover in the next hour and a half. So let me move to the introduction of our two presenters. The first two presenters are my dear colleagues, Miriam Demirci, who is the International Advisor in the Demographic and Social Statistics branch here at the UN Statistics Division, and Mr. James Raymer, who is the professor in the School of Demography, Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University. I believe, James, you are the first to go, so if you want to take the floor, thanks.
Thank you, Francesca. I believe there are some slides that we have to share with you. Close that. Okay, so sorry, let me see if I can make this bigger. So it's a great pleasure to be here to present this framework to you. I thank you for joining this side event, and I want to make it clear that Mariam and I are presenting on behalf of the expert group, so by all means, we're just here as representatives. So yeah, we've been working quite hard for the past 2 years trying to come up with a framework to improve statistics on international migration. Next slide, please. And there are 4 things I want to focus on. Of course, the documents are online, so this is just a brief presentation on the overall conceptual frameworks that we're providing. But the key things I want to get across in this presentation, oh, sorry, one more thing. I'm going to present the kind of key aspects of the conceptual framework, and Miriam's going to talk about the key definitions. So we've split the presentation in that way. Okay, so the 4 key aspects of the conceptual framework that we're proposing is, first, in order to think about international migration and to measure it in terms of statistics, we need to place it in the wider concept of international mobility. Okay, so that's the first thing. So we want to distinguish and identify migration in terms of other international movements. The second thing that we believe is fundamental to the measurement of migration and to improving statistics and availability of migration data is to make a direct link between migration flows and population stocks. And this is fundamental not only to understanding the population movements or the migration patterns, but also to improving statistics. We identify 4 populations that form the basis for all measurements of migration. And these are 4 populations defined according to country of birth and country of citizenship. Okay, and this is kind of the basic framework for which we connect flows and stocks together. And the last thing is we recognize the need and the importance of statistics on other types of international movements that may not become part of the population. So these are other types of temporary international movements, and we include this as part of the framework. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to walk you through some of the key diagrams. So the first one is that distinguishing migration and other international movements. So the way we're thinking about it, and this is I think this is a nice change, is we first start with populations. So rather than think about migration flows and defining them in independent of other things, we first think about, well, what is a population and how does that population change? So a population at a certain point in time, it consists really of 2 populations. We have our resident population. This is the main population of interest, which forms the basis for international statistics on populations. These are people who normally reside in the country or live in, or considered living in the country. And then we've got other people who are in the country but are not considered to be living there. They're there temporarily. They're there visiting family, maybe taking short-term educational courses, doing seasonal work, lots of things. Okay, so we start with these 2 populations, and we think about how these populations change over time. And so the mechanisms of change are demographic components of change. So we have births and deaths, but the ones we're most interested, of course, are in the international movements, and those can be defined as in terms of international arrivals, consisting of new residents. These are people becoming part of the resident population, and non-resident arrivals are people who are adding to the temporary population. And likewise, we subtract people who are leaving the country to live in another country. Those would be your immigrants. And we have people who are departing, who never became part of the population. So that's kind of our starting. This is our starting point. Next slide, please. And the key thing here that we want to get across is we want alignment of our migration flows with residential population change. Okay, and the idea here is if we have this alignment, we get and migration flows are defined in accordance to the residence requirement in each country, then we'll get consistency in national statistics. So the other thing that we were emphasizing is we need migration statistics to be first and foremost important for countries, gathering the data, measuring the data, and this will create consistent demographic accounts or consistent statistics on population change. From there, we believe that this will also improve international comparability in migration. So, linking the 2 together. So, yeah, so flows are integral for understanding resident population change. Next slide, please. So how do we define migration in relation to other types of international movements? Well, this framework is kind of showing the thought process that we go through. So first, you could think about international arrivals, anybody entering a country. And the way we distinguish migration from other international arrivals is through duration of stay. So duration of stay is a key element. And the way we define migration in relation to other types of movements is in order to become a migrant or an immigrant into a country, they must meet the minimum requirement of the residence requirement. So whatever the country uses as its basis for measuring populations, and the United Nations currently has two definitions for the resident population, which is at least 6 months or 6 months and 1 day. Most of the year you spend in the country, you're a resident, or at least 12 months. So those are kind of the two options that are in the United Nations recommendations for population statistics. And we've lined our international migration frameworks up to that population framework. For those who don't meet the minimum requirement, they're become part of the temporary population, and they're temporary considered temporary movements. Now, for those who meet the minimum requirement, there are two types of arrivals that can occur. There are your new residents, your immigrants, and there we have your returning residents, so residents who went abroad temporarily, but maybe they will be coming back. Okay, so those two groups are part of your resident population, and the other group will become part of your temporary population. And then we have the counter flows also, the people leaving. So immigrants, people leaving the population. Those are people who are away for at least 6 months or at least 12 months. They leave the population, should no longer be counted. And you'll also have residents temporarily leaving abroad, but they won't leave the resident population. Okay, next slide. As part of the documentation, we provided some detailed demographic accounting tables and explained how they work, but the demographic accounting framework allows us to reconcile population change and what we're interested in, migration, making sure that migration is placed in the context of overall population change. And in doing this, we realized there are 4 key subpopulations that we would want to reconcile. And as I said before, these are defined by country of birth and country of citizenship. But really what we're interested in is we're interested in the native-born citizens. We're interested in foreign-born who have become citizens, or maybe of children of citizens born outside the country. We have native-born foreign citizens, and we have foreign-born foreign citizens. And these are kind of our 4 key populations that we talk about. Each has its own policy element and interest in terms of examining migration. And we talk about how, and we describe how each of those 4 populations change and through births, deaths, and migration. Next slide, please. And the basic idea, this doesn't include the births and deaths, but we have as our core, we have our population stocks, so our immigrant populations and our native populations. And most countries will gather data according to where someone was born or whether they have citizenship. For example, our passports include both pieces of information. So we think this is feasible in terms of gathering population data on this. And the key part of the framework is to also think about how these 4 populations change. And so we would also want to gather information on the immigration and emigration flows according to these characteristics. Now, part of the framework, you'll see some arrows moving. So the upper part in the center box has the upper part is citizens and the lower part is foreign citizens. Citizens can be born in the country or born outside, and foreign citizens likewise can be born in the country outside. Now, you can't change your birthplace. That's fixed forever, but you can change your citizenship. So part of the framework, and I think part of the understanding of migration, is looking at the pathways between being a foreign citizen and becoming a national citizen for each country. Next slide, please. Okay, and the last slide I'll present has to do with international temporary mobility. And this is different. This is more complicated. I wouldn't say it's the core of our work, but this could probably further develop. But one of the things I think that's important to realize is, or what came out of all our discussions is, first, countries do want to gather information on other types of movements besides migration. So there are lots of short duration international moves that are policy relevant, whether it's seasonal agricultural workers, long-term family visits, what have you. But what's different from this in international migration is really the type of move and the duration of the move. So here you'd want to combine two. You'd not only want to know how many people are coming in, but you'd want to know how long they're staying. And what this diagram is showing is that you get different types of moves depending on whether you're staying for days. So this would be more commuting, cross-border movements for work, or short-term visits to family and friends, versus people who are coming for months, longer durations. This could be for training or education, seasonal or short-term contract workers, and so on. So that's kind of the introduction. I know it's a brief introduction. I hope you've read the documents, and I understand we'll be able to answer questions later on, but I will now hand over to Mariam, who will talk about key definitions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Now, our second part of our presentations will focus on the key definitions. So first one is related with this talk. How we define immigrant population. James explained while he were explaining the conceptual frameworks. We are focusing on the two types of the data, stocks and flows for international migration. Immigrant population, it includes the people who are residents in the country and who were born outside the country, who are foreign born, or who are foreign citizens. These two concepts, I mean, the country of birth and the citizenship, actually are two common concepts and widely used by countries to measure the immigrant population, stock of the migrants. Whatever data source, I mean, it's widely available using the census data and administrative data. So it's probably the many countries will not have any difficulties to produce the immigrant population. These two concepts, country of birth and citizenship, they have some advantages. I mean, compared to the meaning of the two concepts. Country of birth cannot be changed over time. So it's a constant the definitions for the immigrant population. On the other hand, citizenship can be changed. So the person can change their citizenship and the transfer from foreign citizens to the nation citizens. Country of birth is really the informations that it shows also that the person has changed their place of residence at least once during his or her life. On the other hand, citizenship actually distinguishes access to a wide range of services and also the protections. For example, if person moved to the nation citizens, then they can get the better benefits and also participate in the social insurance system. On the other hand, the immigrant population is also use the same concepts, but targeting the different population groups, as James just mentioned, that all the frameworks actually focusing on the important population groups, and the immigrant population is measured using again the country of birth and citizenship information, and this includes all people who are all citizens, national citizens, and also or the native born people, but they are residing in another country at a given point in time. Why stock is important? It's important also because to understand the characteristics and the changes in the stocks of the immigrant population and immigrant population. These are the key concepts, and the countries probably will not face any difficulties, but maybe for immigrant population, they may have some challenges to produce. But it's important to mention that the changes in the size and structure of the stocks of the migrants are basically determined by the flows of the migrants. How we define the flows? Can you move, please, next slide? Next slide, please. Yes. So how we define, no, that's not the correct one. So we have another slide. Yes, that's the correct one. Yes. International migrants. How we define international migrants? This is the people who are residing in the country in a given year, and who stayed in the country, live in the country, at least minimum duration for residence. It could be at least 6 months and 1 day, or 1 year, continuously live in the country. So depending on the criteria used for duration of the stay for residence, the definitions, flows of the international migrations will be measured. So it shows also that, as James explained, if we use the same criteria that we use for measuring resident population, the migrant flows and the resident population will be consistent. I would like to also mention that the immigrant population, the international migrants, could be either immigrants or emigrants. So the immigrants include people who are returning citizens, or who could be the returning native borns, and also the foreign born and foreign citizens. So the stock of international migrants includes all 4 types of people. And the main criteria is to joining the resident population within a year and meeting with this minimum duration criteria that use for international, measuring the immigrants, and also the same criteria for the resident population. An immigrant, on the other hand, is the people who move to another country and become a resident of another country within a year. And these immigrants also includes foreign borns, foreign citizens, native born, and native citizens. So the international migrants, when we measure international migrants, actually we consider all 4 types of population groups. Yeah, next slide. As I said, I'm just focusing on the definitions of key concepts, but you will get really the detailed discussions, more definitions in the report that we submitted to the Statistical Commission. How we define international temporary mobility? That includes all movements that cross international border and do not result in a change of country of residence. So there is a clear distinction between what is international migration and what is temporary mobility. So the arrivals, within a year, they will join the temporary population in the country, and then when they depart, they leave the temporary population. So what is important here is that temporary mobility, the people who move to another country temporarily, they will not change their place of residence. They will there just temporarily. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. For the international temporary mobility, in our report, we are focusing on the 4 types of reasons, actually. So this is the temporary mobility includes all foreign citizens. They are only considering the foreign citizens who move to the country to engage in the labor market, or to utilize the educational training services, or they are there for seeking health and medical care services, or they are seeking asylum or protections as a refugee. So these are the key concepts that we are suggesting for the temporary mobility: the cross-border workers, seasonal workers, training-related mobility, health-related mobility, and asylum seekers in transit. I will just give the definition of cross-border workers to give you really idea how we distinguish this with the migration. Cross-border workers are the people that they move to another country to be engaged in the economic activity on a regular basis. It could be the daily movement or for example, the weekly movement, but they don't change their place of residence. They are there just to participate the economic activity. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes. Now, I would like to give a few points that we think that is really important to see, to understand what are the main major changes in the current recommendation, in the revised recommendations or conceptual framework. Definition of country of residence. This is the first point that I want to mention. The 1998 recommendations defines the place of residence as a place to live where he or she normally spends the daily period of rest. So you can see that there is no criteria for duration of stay. Proposed conceptual framework suggests the definitions that are already actually produced. This is an international recommendations actually, and I'm sure you are all familiar with the international guidelines, the principles and recommendations on population housing censuses. The latest version was produced in 2015. And the international guidelines suggest, in our current recommendations, we also use the same criteria and define the resident population as people who are spending most of the time in the country within a year, suggesting two options for duration criteria: whether people stayed at least 6 months and 1 day during a 1 year, or at least 12 months. Another important difference is related to the definition of international migration. The 1998 recommendations actually suggest two types of international migration. One is the long-term migration, another one is short-term migration. Long-term migration use the 12 months criteria. Is the migrants who changed their place of residence and stayed there at least 12 months within a year continuously. The short-term term migration use a different criteria. If people stayed in the country at least 3 months and less than 12 months, they are considered as a short-term migrants. What we propose in the conceptual frameworks, we are proposing only one type of international migrants. They are the people who change their place of residence and using the same criteria that we use for defining the resident population. Therefore, we can achieve the consistency in the national statistics. And with this way, actually, we make the really distinguish between the migrants and other types of mobility. Next slide, please. Yes. Another important difference is as I said actually just now, the proposed conceptual framework distinguish international migration from other type of mobility. And this is, we believe that this is important, the changes. The last point that I would like to mention is ensuring the coherence between the international migration flows and the stock data, which is immigrant population. So this can be achieved through reconciling the demographic components of change for these 4 key subpopulation groups. James already mentioned that this report also the discussions on the accounting, the demographic accounting, how we can what kind of data we need to achieve the consistency, coherence between the flows and stocks, and how we can understand the changes in the stock through the flow data. Next slide. Okay. As an end, we would like to mention a few points as a summary. So based on this framework, it's really, I think, the important maybe to discuss that the quality and availability of statistics on migration flows and temporary population movements needs to be improved. During our discussions in the task force and expert group, in the expert group on international migration, this was widely also discussed how we can improve the availability and quality of the flow data. And also if countries are interested in producing the statistics on temporary population movements, how we can improve those statistics. And it should be maybe highlighted that this conceptual framework are designed from a national statistical perspective. And if we are aligning the flows and stocks, this will improve the quality at the national level and comparability at the international level. And we mentioned several times in our presentations that these four population groups, foreign-born foreign citizens, foreign-born nation citizens, national-born nation citizens, and national-born and nation citizens, these are the four groups, population groups, and that important for policies on international migration and measuring the migration statistics. And the final point that I would like to mention is the type of the temporary population movements, and their relative importance are expected to vary by countries and the locations. So the amount of the temporary movements will depend on the conditions of the countries. And the countries that they believe the temporary movement have a significant influence on the economic and social settings of the country, the measurements, the indicators related to the temporary mobility can be produced. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation. Yeah, it's over you, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, James and Miriam, for this very clear and comprehensive overview of the revised conceptual framework. I really hope that our colleagues in the room have a better sense of what we are bringing to the attention of the Commission in a couple of weeks. But of course, we are here to respond to any questions or needs for clarification you may have. Please use the chat box. I think that's the easiest way to communicate. And while you are thinking of the possible questions to ask to our experts, I'm going to give the floor to two colleagues from national statistical offices who really help us in putting together this revised conceptual framework. So I think the first one is Diego Iturralde, who is the Chief of Demography and Population Statistics from Statistics South Africa. Diego, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I'm going to share my presentation. There we go. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I'm extremely excited about the possibility to share my views about this new conceptual framework and the updated definitions to the recommendations of international migration statistics. I will be speaking about the way in which these are of application to South Africa, which is where I'm based at the National Statistics Office at Statistics South Africa. And I will indicate to what extent these are usable and what some of the challenges might be. So I will focus a little bit about flow data and stock data, which James made reference to. I'll tell you how measurement of migration occurs in census in South Africa, what the migration data needs in South Africa are, the challenges to the implementation, some words about mobility, which is a key feature of this new framework, and of course some conclusions. So I think that very often migration data is centered around the aggregate, around the stocks, and the analysis of movement of how many people have moved from where to where. However, the aggregate masks the issue of movement of people in a recent period. We may want to ask ourselves the question, have recent trends changed? Are there new patterns that we need to be made aware of? It's beyond any reasonable doubt that flow data in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic will be extremely important, because we will want to see to what extent have these trends of international movement changed as a result of the pandemic as we recover from this situation that we're in. What has the year-on-year change been that is able to inform policy and to update population estimates? And so I think it's quite easy to conclude on this and saying that stock data are widely available, but flow data less commonly available. When we look at data sources for flow data, these can include census questions which focus on the movement since the last census, but are limited to the last move and are only collected every 10 years. We can look at administrative data in the forms of permits, human movement control data at entry points in the case of international migration. We could also take advantage of big data such as Facebook analytics shown by authors like Spiratos et al. And there's a myriad of other innovative sources that IOM GIMDAC stores on the International Migration Web Portal. So the focus here really has to be on collecting inflow data, because we know and we understand that stock data is something that we have in good supply. With regards to the measurement of migration in census in South Africa, well, census is the most authoritative international migration collection instrument that we have in South Africa. It covers inflows based on information on your last move. The migration is measured with reference to a de facto household, and that household is comprised of all resident members at the time of the census. We are currently implementing the 6 months plus 1 day definition that James and Miriam made reference to. A significant challenge is the undercount, and undercount is adjusted by a post-enumeration survey, and in particular this undercount is driven by access to high walled areas, particularly in wealthier parts of the country. With regards to flow data, we can combine question P08A and P11, which I'll show you just now, in combination to measure flows and to show disaggregation by country of birth, although not by country of origin, which is what would be more ideal. So there we can see question P08, which would be in which country was this person born, and question P11 would be, has this person been living in this place since the previous census, since 2001. So obviously when we do the 2021, the reference period will be 2011. So some of the challenges that we have with regards to collecting migration data in South Africa are answering questions honestly for fear of victimization. There have been various episodes or outbreaks of xenophobic behavior, and there are pockets of anti-migrant sentiment on the go. So this certainly impacts how people respond to these questions. We also have a challenge of the incorrect following of instructions with respect to questions of usual residence. So this is the question on the 6 months and 1 day, and what happens to those respondents who do not meet that criteria. In other words, the mobile people that the new framework had identified. Comments have been made about the need for granularity of origin and destination. I think in many countries in the world, where there are large populations from a particular country, it's no more of interest to say that there are so many people, so many Chinese people, for example, living in the United States, but we want to know from which part of China are Chinese people living in which part of the United States. And so in the same vein, the large migrant population from Zimbabwe and Mozambique living in South Africa, we may have similar questions in that regard. And then we must also take into account that the questions on migration are competing for space in a census questionnaire, which is already very full. There are probably in excess of 80 questions covering demographics, education, labor market, household dynamics, and migration is just one extra topic that needs to fight for questions in the questionnaire. So I think if we have a look at the data landscape, we should ask ourselves, firstly, what is the problem that we want to answer through this framework? We can say that there's possibly a paucity of data, particularly recent data, that we're not utilizing existing data. Data producers are working in silos. There are problems with regards to data sharing and gaps in knowledge on what is known. And so we need to put together this kind of framework for international comparability. We need a set of standard terms and definitions, and we need timely data. We can't be sitting in 2021 and still making reference to census data of 2011, which is unfortunately what we are doing. The reason for this is that we want to report on the SDGs disaggregated by migrant status. We want to report on the global compact of migration and refugees. We want to foster a culture of evidence-based decision and policy making. We wanted to contribute towards planning, towards monitoring and evaluation, and basically have an evidence-based narrative and discourse that is not anecdotal and which takes away, that occupies the space that people who are doing exactly the opposite are currently occupying. So what are our data needs? What do we want to, what is the story we want to tell? And so I think we want to, first of all, say what type of migration are we seeing? Forced migration, are we seeing asylum seekers, refugees, documented, undocumented? I mean, the list is in reality much longer than just these 4 points. We also want to know, why are people migrating? What is the main reason for migrating? Is it related to economic opportunities, to academic studies, family reunification, and there are also many other reasons. We want to know who are the people who are migrating in terms of their age, their sex, socioeconomic status, their level of education, and whether they are employed or not, or even if they were employed in their place of origin. We'd like to know, when did this migration occur? We can look at this in terms of period migration, which I explained just now with regards to flow migration, or in terms of lifetime migration. And what are the trends and patterns in this regard? How are migrants traveling into South Africa? What is their mode of transport? What is the extent of trafficking and smuggling? And what are the characteristics with regards to these? And of course, The question of unaccompanied minors is also a cause for concern if we are now going to be speaking about vulnerable groups who are moving into the country. This is an important group to look at. And finally, the question that is always on everybody's lips is how many? How do we count these, and what are the methods in which to count? And how do we bring together the administrative data sources with censuses and surveys in order to answer this particular question? So as Miriam has just gone through some of the definitions, I think the main thing that I want to stress here is that there's an evolution of definitions, and this needs to and has been updated as part of the framework. I think history, and in particular a country like South Africa with a colonial history, has got a particular context with regards to its migrant population, and this needs to be taken into account. In terms of the sources of data, this is a acronym which I've come up with, which I call the ABCDES, to establish the types of data. We have administrative data, which may be visas, residence work permits, as well as border data collection. Big data from innovative emerging sources, from banks, cell phone data, social media, census, which I've spoken about. Then demographic and health surveillance sites. These are predetermined geographic areas in which where it's a controlled region that has got specific characteristics, where academic institutions measure demographic phenomena, including migration in these areas. In South Africa, we have 3 with the possibility of extending to 7, but there are plenty other demographic and health surveillance sites in other developing countries around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a very useful resource that we should use. Population estimates. Not many countries have the capacity for putting together population estimates. So we're saying here that we need to invest in population estimates, which include the ability to produce migration streams as an output of these estimates. And finally, household surveys are an important source of information. South Africa is currently inserting migration modules into KEYS surveys in order to produce a variety of indicators on an annual basis. And we also have, I'll speak about it a little bit later on, the opportunity of an African migration survey, which will be linked to the framework and to the new definitions that we have shared with you this afternoon. So some of the challenges towards the implementation would be the importance of creating migration data whilst using a common set of definitions and a framework that needs to be agreed upon for global comparison. So inter-country comparability is really important in this regard. Secondly, we need to create an institutional framework that enables the sharing of anonymized data between government departments as well as the corporate sector. We're all saying how much data is out there and that we're not using it. Well, I think one of the main reasons we're not using it is because we're not sharing it, and because there is a uncertainty about how the data will be used if we share it. Thirdly, we need to identify and apply appropriate methods for the implementation of new initiatives. How do we use social media data in order for it to be nationally representative and for it to be used as an official statistic? And fourthly, we need to promote the skills that are required for analysis and to produce policy relevant evidence. So we need people who have the skills that can take these various data sources and create knowledge and evidence which will inform our policymakers adequately. The importance of these definitions and the framework to South Africa are extremely important, because the use of a framework and their associated definitions are important for us to know what are we measuring. If we can't measure it, we can't manage it, is what a former finance minister in South Africa once mentioned. In terms of international migration, although we're not focusing on that in this meeting, the planning of services is important as people move. But in terms of international migration, we need to be able to update stocks and flows, to understand these flows and to understand what services are required, and to quantify the economic impact of migrants when we are talking about international migration. A very key example, a current example of this would be the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. Although government has taken an approach that says that everybody will be part of a vaccine rollout, whether a South African citizen or a foreign citizen or undocumented individual, we need to know where are these international migrants and what is their ability to receive these important vaccines. Now, with regards to mobility, which we said is a key new feature of this framework, we know that census are not a good source of data to collect temporary movements because they are run every 5 to 10 years, and they take place at a specific point in time in the year, which may not be a time when temporary movements are occurring. Administrative records, on the other hand, are possibly better suited, but they are focused on a particular type of movement only: tourists, seasonal workers, business travelers, etc., or for particular types of movements. So there is a need for data on measuring the many types of international mobility that do not result in a change of country of residence. In other words, for people who move into South Africa for less than 6 months and 1 day. So in conclusion, I think almost all analyses and outputs these days are based on stock data, and very little use is made of flow data. Whereas for internal migration, we may say the opposite is true. We need to elevate the benefit of using flow data and to see how does this create more relevant discourse. Thirdly, we need the potential to use various sources to estimate bilateral streams, for which investment in immigration sources is required. I think at some point earlier I mentioned that there's a focus on inflow data, but outflow data is a domain that up to this point has been relatively unexplored. And from an administrative point of view, there's very little incentive for South Africans living abroad to declare themselves so to an embassy or to some kind of authority like that. Fourthly, it's essential to align data collection initiatives to the conceptual framework and definitions, and also to capacitate data owners to collect data appropriately in line with this. The road ahead towards this implementation is that South Africa supports the conceptual framework in principle and its objectives in particular. In order to implement this, government-wide investment in administrative statistics is required, and this is receiving attention in South Africa at the moment. This particularly relates not only to the issue of types of mobility, but also to breaking down the types of foreign-born persons in categories aligned to the framework. So out of foreign-born persons, how many of them meet the criteria to be called migrants? How many are mobile or people here temporarily? And of course, we can break that down further into labor migrants, educational migrants, etc., etc. In terms of flow data, we need data sources should be capacitated to measure flows from country of origin, and should be integrated with various sources in order to determine the country of destination along with the profiles of such persons. And I'm pleased to say that Statistics South Africa is already implementing an organization-wide strategy from 2020 to 2025, which places emphasis on an interconnected statistical system as one of its key strategic outputs, in order to improve lives through data ecosystems. Then finally, just some opportunities that the framework and the definitions currently have. The African Union has agreed to support the piloting of a world migration survey in Africa, with various African countries, including South Africa, forming the pilot. And it's clear to say that the framework and definitions will form the basis of such a survey. And secondly, that establishment of a national forum for migration and urbanization across all of government, including the NGO sector and the academic sector, is to be established in the first half of this year. And this will assist with migration management, including the questions of measurement of migration data sources, and of course that these data sources should be tied and will be tied to the framework and its definitions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diego. This is such a rich presentation that we will study for sure afterwards. We are taking careful notes because you are really bringing, you're really highlighting all sorts of issues. But I'm happy to hear that Statistics South Africa is supporting the implementation of the conceptual framework. Of course, I'm not surprised. You were also part of the discussion, but that's overall a very good news. I just want to highlight a couple of things that you mentioned that are critically important because they also introduce the next steps for the expert group on migration statistics, now that we are sort of wrapping up our work on the conceptual framework. You touched on the importance of ensuring that all the data that we are collecting are policy relevant to really ensure that once they are produced, they will be used. And just to inform our audience, we have a dedicated task force in the expert group on migration statistics that is looking into this important component of our work. Of course, already to establish the conceptual framework, we mapped, we highlighted the key policy needs at the country level. We studied the GCM, we looked at the SDGs, and we identified the key policy and research questions that us as statisticians, we should be able to provide data for. But the next step, once the conceptual framework is approved, is really to move into the implementation, is really to come up with a strategy on how to operationalize this theoretical framework. And of course, that's a huge job ahead of us because we will need to map the solutions that we want to propose to countries based on the different data sources that they are using. And again, Diego, you pointed out how complex this data ecosystem can be at the country level. So we will really need to pay a lot of attention and look at best practices and learn from all of you, learn from the countries that are helping us in the revision of the 1998 recommendations. So I'm happy to invite our second discussant, our friend and colleague Jason Schachter, who is the chief of NET International Migration Branch at the US Census Bureau. Jason, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Francesca. So you're going to open up my presentation, I think, is that right? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to discuss this important document. The first half of this discussion, I'll make some basic comments about the framework, and then I'll follow that up with the second half on discussing the application of this new guidelines or framework to the United States. So first, let me just commend the efforts of the task force for developing this new conceptual framework, because we know this was no easy task. I was not part of the actual task force. I was invited to, but I declined because I knew, based on my prior experiences in the UN, how difficult this was going to be and frustrating, as well as some other commitments that I had. But your work was definitely appreciated. So despite what it might seem like from some of my comments, just keep that in mind that I think this was a Herculean effort on your part. All right, next slide, please. And so this is sort of an overview of some of the aims of the guideline. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I'll just say the last comment, the last bullet, that it's to help production of population estimates and projections. That's what my branch specifically does. So that's really a lot of the focus when I think about the application of these guidelines. Okay, next slide. And let's go to the next one. This is just an overview of the definitions that we already heard from James and Miriam. So let's just go next slide, please. Okay, so these are, this is what I call the good slide. So in terms of the conceptual framework, I like, in theory, I really like the new framework. I think it makes sense. It's simpler than the previous recommendations. I think that's beneficial. It gets rid of some things that people have been stuck on for these past, I guess it's been 23 years now, but it gets rid of the distinction between short-term and long-term migration, as well as this change of country of usual residence to now change of residence. It also emphasizes the consistency between stocks and flows at a national level, which I think is important. And lastly, it provides flexibility for defining international migration. Now, this is a pro and a con in that it comes at the cost of international comparability, where I think that this becomes an issue, which as long as it's denoted in the guidelines, I think it's okay, but you really need to make sure that people understand that that's what this is going to mean. All right, next slide. So in terms of practice, first we had our theory. Now this is the data requirements that we're going to need to carry out some of these guidelines. Now these guidelines are more, I mean, they encompass more than the previous recommendations because they include all forms of international mobility. And that opens up a whole a lot of issues with data and definitions, as we'll get into. And it's going to require, to produce comparable statistics on both international migration and temporary movements will require very high data requirements. You'll have to have access to individual data on all border crossings if you want to do this completely. So that would mean access to administrative data, visas, border crossings. Another option would be detailed migration histories that could be collected through survey instruments. In terms of data, you also need duration of stay at a month, at the month level. So this is both actual duration as well as intended duration. And it also would be helpful to know purpose of move to be able to help define some of these different groups. Okay, next slide. This is a summary of, I'm not going to go through this again, but these are some of the types of international temporary mobility that are denoted in the report. I think here, there's a lot of other groups here that aren't included, like tourists and visitors, business travelers, day travelers, that will need to be included in this definition. These are, I think, relatively policy relevant groups, and though some of these other things are outside the scope of international migration. So anyway, we need to keep that in mind when we're defining these areas. Next slide. Yeah, and I just wanted to, in the expert group meeting of June and the outcome document, there was discussion about a lot of these groups being out of scope of these recommendations, and that would include the groups like tourists and business travelers. And one of my questions was whether this was still the case, because there's really a lot of emphasis placed on this temporary mobility in this document. So it wasn't clear to me if these were still considered out of scope. And I would encourage them to remain out of scope if it's not the case. Next slide. Yeah, so again, it's sort of summary of some of the things with international temporary mobility. I think it's a very prominent feature of this new conceptual framework. I mean, it takes up more than half of the new document. It is a very difficult group to measure and does have intensive data requirements. And a lot of these temporary movers have no relation to international migration. And from a population estimates perspective, most of these groups we would not need information on. And lack of information on informal movement would make using a visa-oriented system make it more difficult to accurately measure this temporary population. This is definitely the case in the U.S., at least pre-COVID. Things have changed. Borders are tighter now than they have in the past, but definitely missing informal movements if you're limited to using administrative data. And there's also many differences between these different types of international mobility, which are going to require different approaches and classifications, as well as data sources. So it's opening up a lot more complexity in this version of the guidelines. Okay, next slide. So in terms of implementation in the United States, it would be difficult. I mean, the US has a decentralized federal statistical system where different pieces of migration data are created from different agencies, and we don't have ways of accessing data from these agencies very easily. There's a Census Bureau. We produce the census and a lot of household surveys. The Bureau of Labor Statistics produces information on labor migration statistics. Department of Homeland Security has border crossing data. State Department has visas issued and refugees, etc. In the U.S., migration is defined based on the criteria of the data sources that you're using to measure it, and whether or not this meets international standards is dependent on that data source. In terms of the U.S., we have no direct measures at the Census Bureau of monthly duration of stay or reason for move, though there are a few exceptions on some of our smaller surveys which don't have a large enough sample size to really meet our needs on a flow basis. All right, next slide. And this is an overview of what the Census Bureau does produce. We have 3 main surveys: the American Community Survey, which is about 2 million households, Current Population Survey, which has a reason for move question, and the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a much smaller survey, but it does collect detailed migration history information, which would provide information on the month of when somebody moved in. So that's available, but it's not a large enough sample to do much with it. Right, next slide. So currently, we use the American Community Survey to estimate international migration. It's based on a residence 1 year ago question. And now this survey includes all persons residing, actual or intended, in the United States for more than 2 months in its sample. So that becomes, a much larger group than what we would what these UN recommendations are suggesting. There's no way to know. We know when somebody was sampled in the survey during the year, but we don't know how long they've been in the U.S. specifically, other than the year of entry question. We can identify, of those 4 groups, we can identify 3 of them. We could really identify all 4. The native-born foreign citizens, we don't collect information on because all people who are born in the U.S. are U.S. citizens. So they don't bother to ask that question for those who were born in the U.S. Again, we can't identify monthly duration of stay, and we also can't identify purpose of movement. So it does limit us in terms of what we could do with this data. So next slide. So alternatively, we could look, these are administrative data sources, which I think would be needed to do this. So right now at the Census Bureau, these are the different agencies and the different data that they produce. At the Census Bureau, we do have a data sharing agreement with the Internal Revenue Service, so we can get tax data, and we link that to the Social Security data, country of birth information, which gives us some information. We also have an agreement, or had an agreement, with Department of Homeland Security to get a file called the Lawful Permanent Residence File. Now, even though we have an agreement, it doesn't mean we received the data. And in the 5 years I've been at the Census Bureau, we've only received the data once in those 5 years, even though it's supposed to be an annual thing. So even though you have an agreement, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to receive that data. And there's a lot of other data from other agencies that we have no access to: Customs Border, Immigration, Customs Enforcement, Bureau of Transportation, Department of State, Department of Justice. So anyway, we've worked on contacting these agencies, and sometimes we get special tabulations, but we don't have regular access to these, which would be needed. Okay, next slide. So continuing what I was just talking about, if we were going to adapt these new recommendations, we would have to use a new methodology to measure it. Visa types would be one possibility. Those are issued by the State Department and compiled by the Department of Homeland Security. Visas are issued for a particular duration and can be extended. You don't know how long the person actually stays, or if it expires, whether they leave the country. Certain non-immigrant, not what we call non-immigrant visas, are valid up to 6 years. So by using non-immigrant, immigrant visa distinction isn't very helpful. And we also issue daily traveler visas, which are good for 3 days, which gets at some of this temporary mobility. I think more beneficial would be border control information, and the U.S. Customs and Border Control does have a data system called the Arrival and Departure Information System, ADIS, and this has individual information on people who are issued visas, when they cross the border, how long they're expected to remain in the country, when things are renewed. So this, in theory, this would be a great treasure trove of information. There are coverage limitations. Some land border crossings aren't included in the data, and it does only include formal movement. We still don't, I know very little about the data quality. I mean, from working with those other administrative data, we know there are a lot of issues with the quality, and the data needs to be cleaned up considerably. So I don't know if that's the case with this data. Also, we don't know to what extent exits are monitored for the immigration piece of the puzzle. And even more, a bigger issue is that this data is inaccessible to the Census Bureau. Even at the Department of Homeland Security, they have an Immigration Statistics Office, and they only can receive access to tabulated data from them. They don't have access to the individual data. That group is not willing to share information willingly, and to be honest, I don't think there'd be any way we could ever get access to individual level data from that agency. Okay, next slide. This slide is, we do have access to publicly available border crossing information. This is an interesting slide in that it compares land border crossings between Canada and the United States at a monthly level between 2010 and 2018. And this is really just to show the lack of data quality. If you notice, if you looked at this closely, you'd see that most of these movers are coming from Canada to the US, and the net would mean that we're basically being invaded by Canadians, which, I mean, is true to some extent, but pre-COVID, but it's not to the extent that's shown through this data. So obviously the US is picking up far more movements from Canada to the US than the US is to Canada. So this is that issue of the quality of border crossing data and whether we could even use it for our estimates. Okay, next slide. So a summary in the US situation, currently we have no effort to collect information on international temporary mobility. And it's not needed for production of our international migration estimates. Some non-migrants per these UN recommendations are included in our ACS estimates, which are based on a 2-month residency criteria. In terms of border crossing information, flight data we know has very complete coverage as people are scanned as they come in and out of to the country, but that's not the case for US land and sea borders, and we don't really, not as sure of the quality of that information. And there are some special border surveys that exist. Mexico collects data on border crossers. I know that has been discontinued or suspended due to the COVID issue, but prior to that, they did collect information on Mexicans coming to and from the United States crossing the border, at least from a sample survey perspective. Okay, last slide. So sort of my summary and some of the questions I had about this, sort of the overarching theme is this theory versus practice. I mean, we can like what we like in terms of conceptual frameworks, but actually being able to implement this becomes a more complicated issue. I think the multiple ways of defining resident population hampers international comparability. And then I also worry about the emphasis on measuring international temporary mobility, which is not a form of international migration. And, are we opening a Pandora's box trying to measure this group? It would require a lot of dependence on visa data, which would lack information on informal movements. And that then brings me to the next question, whether if we included this, would this actually be an improvement over the previous recommendations in terms of complexity? And I pulled out 2 lines from the actual report that was written, and I'm wondering if these are going to be said, the same thing are going to be said about the 2021 or 2022 recommendations, that it's, is it too difficult to operationalize, and is it too complex, requiring advanced administrative data systems, which I think this really would require having a lot of detailed border crossing information, and I don't know how applicable it's going to be for most of the world. Another question I have is, Diego touched on some of this, but how will alternative data sources such as big data be tied into operationalizing these new definitions? And finally, from the US perspective, this would require new methodologies at the US Census Bureau, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it would be very difficult to produce separate estimates of international temporary mobility. And as I said earlier, it wouldn't be, it's actually not needed for our population estimates. So it'd be difficult to get people on board on that. That would require detailed administrative data from the Department of Homeland Security, which, as I said, is not a realistic option. And that's it. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, and also for your honesty in coming up with this set of questions that I like to bring to the attention of our previous speakers. I think they have some answers for all of us. I also want to acknowledge your role in these next steps for the expert group, because Jason is co-leading the task team, the task force that is looking into how to improve data availability by integrating different data sources. So we are really looking at your contribution on those next steps that will help us in moving from the theory that we are discussing today, the conceptual framework, so that will help us in moving from the theory to the practice and really provide a hands-on type of guidance to our national statistical offices. But we are running out of time. We still have the intervention from Frank, who is the director at IOM. Frank, give me just a couple of minutes. I think that both Jason and Diego brought up a few interesting questions, and I would like to give the opportunity to Miriam and James, who are the authors of the reports that are brought to the attention of the Commission for adoption. So a lot of questions have been pointed out. Maybe you can focus in your answers to the issue of international comparability, and maybe we lose a little bit of international comparability, but what are the advantages in this conceptual framework from the National Statistical Office's perspective? And also the issue of the international temporary mobility, I think is Jason that is also questioning how do we, what are our priorities in terms of international migrations versus international temporary mobility. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Miriam,
yeah.
do you want me
James,
to?
yeah,
Or
yeah,
would you
please,
like to?
yeah. No, please start, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think we should add also the kind of the theory complexity aspect to that list, because I think that's an important question too. So in terms of international comparability, well, I've worked a lot on estimating migration flows, and there's not, I mean, we've looked at the definitional differences between a 6-month definition of migration and a 12-month definition. And the difference is about 10% in the levels in terms of migration flows. So people who are staying in a country for at least 6 months as a new migrant is not going to be radically different from someone who's staying 12 months. There will be a difference, but the difference will be slight. And that's based on I have data from countries with population registers. There's a lot of European countries who have looked at this. But I think the huge advantage will be the accounting aspect of flows. We'll have flows that are where national fiscal offices have matched up their flows to their population. So they're no longer treated independently. They actually have a meaningful statistic. And so long as we know how countries are measuring their populations, we at least know how countries are measuring their flows, which will be a huge step forward in understanding current migration patterns. Because right now, statistics on migration flows range from all sorts of definitions. No two countries collect migration in the same way or use the same systems, and a lot of them are integrating different sources. So at least if we can get the national accounts, the population accounts in order, I believe that'll be first and foremost a benefit to the countries, and it will improve international comparability. And in the long run, we could think about standardizing the population statistic to one definition, but in the short term, at least we'll have statistics that are a benefit to the countries. The second one, sorry, it's like 2:30 in the morning here, so I'm getting a bit spacey in my mind. But sorry, Francesca, what was the second item? Oh, temporary mobility.
Temporary.
Sorry.
Temporary.
No, I think our main emphasis is still on international migration. Okay, so our main point, but to think about international migration, we have to place in the context of all international moves. And we have to recognize that some agencies and some countries treat, so for example, foreign workers, whether they're a resident or not, both groups would have probably similar rights. So in some cases, you don't want to exclude foreign workers who are not residents from your data systems just because they don't meet the definition of migration. So I think there are a lot of situations like that where you'd want probably all international moves. In other situations, such as for your population statistics, you'd only want migration. But in terms of the conceptual framework, I believe that we still emphasize and focus on international migration. But we introduced these international temporary mobility, and we know that's a lot more complex, and we say that in the document. And that needs a lot more work and thought, and the expert group is certainly not. Yeah, we have a long ways to go on that. So I don't think that's the main. I don't think we're treating it equally, and I don't think that's our main focus. But we are recognizing that there is a need there. And the last point I want to mention real quick is this notion that this is too complex, it's too theoretical. I think of it in a different way, that this is kind of a gold standard, or this is what we should be aiming for. And what I like about the current conceptual framework, if you think about it in terms of building blocks, we start first with our immigrant populations. We think about how our immigrant populations change. Okay, and we might start simply, as you do in the United States, think about foreign-born, native-born populations and how those two populations change. And then over time, you might add the citizenship element to it. So I see this as it starts with countries that are collecting primarily based on census data. That's our starting point. And then it expands that to think about how those census population measurements are changing over time, how you might integrate different data sources to develop that change, how to produce better information on flow. So I don't see it as every country is expected to automatically, use the framework as designed. I would agree that's impossible. No country could do that tomorrow. But if we think about this as an ideal, for the next 20 years or something, then I think we would go a long way. So it's designed, at least in my thinking, as a building block system. Miriam, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you, James. I think you answered all questions. Just to mention that when we were designing the conceptual framework, we also look at the recent international recommendations related to the international migration. And the ILO has produced a new guidelines on concerning statistics on international labor migration. And this includes also the cross-border workers or the seasonal workers. So that's the objective actually but as James said, the focus is really on the international migration. And also when we look at the 1998 recommendations, we see that the main focus is on the flow data. But with this new proposed the framework, actually we are really emphasize on both the types of data, flows and the stock data. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Of course, there are many questions and we would need probably at least one day dedicated webinar to cover all the elements that we are touching up today. The good news is that we are actually planning after the Statistical Commission, so starting in March, we will plan a regular meeting with all the experts from national statistical offices. We are putting together a series of webinars to really unpack the conceptual framework and to show you how the technicalities behind what we are proposing. So stay tuned. Today we only have an hour and a half, and the objective was really to give you the taste for what we are bringing to the Statistical Commission, with the understanding that the official documents are there and they are very thorough. So please study those if you have any issues. And in the next couple of weeks, you're still more than welcome to reach out to us, the Statistics Division of the UN, as the Secretariat of the UN Expert Group on Migration Statistics. We are here to answer any of your pending questions. But after the Commission, after the conceptual, we get the okay from the Statistical Commission to further develop and operationalize the conceptual framework, we'll have these longer webinars where we will go back to the concepts and definitions, and James and Miriam and other experts will explain how to produce the statistics in line with this new framework. Frank, you have the last word.
Okay, thanks very much. Look, I'll be very brief. First of all, let me remind you, as co-chair of the expert group on migration statistics, why we started this exercise. And the reasons why we embarked on this exercise are many. First of all, as some of you have heard, the 1998 recommendations were not really being fully implemented. Secondly, the world of migration and mobility has changed greatly since 1998. We have new forms of mobility, we have increases in migration, etc. And thirdly, there are new sources of data, and somebody touched upon the fact that there's big data coming from digital devices, etc. So there were a number of reasons why, after 20 years or so, we needed to look at these recommendations again. And the whole purpose of these recommendations is to provide a conceptual framework to enable countries around the world to build their capacities in this area. But as Stefan Schweinfest, the director of the UN Statistics Division, would probably say to you today, if he was here, the UN has no power to start imposing recommendations on any of you. I mean, this is a voluntary exercise. This is a conceptual framework that we're offering following consultations. It's been a very inclusive process, and we hope that the national statistical offices that are represented today will find this approach useful. And we understand that every national context is different. As we move forward, there are two things to mention in particular. One is that we encourage you to send in written comments through your delegations, to contact your delegations. The next few weeks are incredibly important in the lead up to the UN Statistical Commission meeting in early March. Secondly, on February the 25th, we will have another opportunity for a further discussion about these points. We have invited Francesca and Diego and others to make a presentation at a webinar that IOM is organizing with the African Union's Statistical Office, Stat Afrique, and Statistics Sweden. That will be in the afternoon of February the 25th, and I hope all of you will be able to join for a further discussion, because I think today has been a little bit frustrating because many really interesting points have been raised, but we haven't had the opportunity to discuss enough. Lastly, it's really important to note that there are two background papers buried on the UN Statistical Commission website, but they're excellent papers. One is the report to the UN Secretary General on migration statistics. The second report discusses in detail the conceptual framework, and you will find a lot of the information that was presented today. And those papers underline some really key points. Number one, for example, you will see in the UN Statistical Division paper that data on flows is hardly being reported to the UN Statistics Division at the moment. I think something like 51 countries were able to report such data. So we're still facing huge gaps. And my very last point today is, when we started this work, it was before a global pandemic. As we've learned over the last year or so, data is more important than ever before, but the capacity of statistical offices to collect data on migration is being severely undermined in different parts of the world. So we probably need this conceptual framework more than ever before to help us move forward and to gather better data on migration to answer really, really important policy questions. As Diego mentioned, one of the questions I was asked last week by my colleagues is, how many migrants around the world will need the vaccine? What is the data available at the national level on the number of migrants? So it's really critical how you define migration and how you collect this data for policy purposes. Sorry to have had to rush, but I hope to continue the discussion very soon. Thanks, Francesca.
Thank you, Frank. Excellent intervention. And of course, I'm so sorry that we have to close the meeting. We have so much to discuss and so very little time. But again, this is just the beginning of our conversation with all of you. We will reach out in a month or so to invite you to a series of webinars dedicated to unpacking the conceptual framework to make sure that you as national statistical offices feel comfortable in adopting and implementing them based on the data sources that you have. Frank also mentioned this upcoming event organized by the African Union. You will also be invited to that in case you want to have another presentation from myself and Diego. And finally, this is the opportunity before I close the meeting to thank the expert group on migration statistics. You have been fantastic, working hard over the last couple of years. Step one of our work is concluding, that's the conceptual framework, but of course there is so much more work waiting for us. Apologies, this is the challenge of MS Teams. So much work ahead of us, and I still count on your contribution and commitment to make sure that together we improve the way we measure international migration. So thank you so much. Thanks, Frank, for leading our group together with Diego, and let's stay tuned for our next meeting. Thank you so much, and greetings to all from New York. Be well.
Thank you, Francesca. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.